Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Retail Council of Canada's second webinar in the Enabling Retail 2016 series. My name is Patrick Rogerson, the Manager of Member Programs. Webinar number 2 is going to focus on the impact of the Design of Public Spaces standard underneath the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and we're also going to get into the Ontario Building Code today. For webinar number 2, I'm joined by two individuals, Chris Thompson, Manager of Building Code Policy Development Unit with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and also Wendy Mercia, Human Resources Compliance Manager for TJX Canada. Wendy, Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
For the audience, for questions that will be submitted today, please again take advantage of the Q&A feature on the bottom right-hand side of the WebEx chat feature window. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we will address those at the end of our two presentations after about a half hour today. For questions after today's webinar, please feel free to utilize my information at the bottom of the screen. You can either call me directly or send me an email, and we'll have an answer back to you within 24 to 48 hours. Now, to get right into our presentation, Chris, I know you have a deck that we're going to be looking through today, and we're going to transition away from that. We've had an amount of questions, which is just ridiculous at this point in time. A lot of them are on universal washrooms as well, too. But let me be gentle. I'm not going to ask any questions for a little while. I'll let you get into your presentation, and then we'll bring some of those up.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I just want to make one little caveat here is that I'm not an engineer, so I'm not the guy to be getting into millimeters and kilopascals and other things with. If you have questions on that, by all means get in touch with Patrick or I afterwards, and I can get the technical folks to provide you with more detail. So what I'm going to do, we're looking right now at slide 2 or slide 6 of the one that the Retail Council's put together. Because time is fairly short, I'm going to hopscotch through the high points of the deck, looking for things that are likely to be of interest to retailers. First of all, the main thing to note is that the Building Code is a regulation. It's passed under the Building Code Act 1992, and that governs the construction, renovation, demolition, or change of use of buildings, which is a fairly broad scope. And what it does is we call it the mandatory minimum that you have to accomplish in order to get a building permit. So it sets out technical requirements. It also sets out a number of administrative requirements for applicants and building officials. One of the things that is really important to understand about the Building Code is that it's prospective, which means it does not go backward. So you hear a lot of talk when we did things like accessibility, energy efficiency, and other things. People were concerned that this was going to force change onto existing buildings when nothing was happening. That is not the case. The Building Code does not mandate retrofits. We don't make that happen. If you built to a code, you're assumed to continue to meet the code. The only time that you begin to require changes to catch up are when you're doing new work. So among the things to note is the current Building Code is called the 2012 Building Code. Given the wonderful way these things work, it actually came into effect in January 1st, 2014. It was named on the basis of when the code was actually filed. And the other thing to note is that your municipal building departments are really the people you need to be relating to when it actually comes to building permit applications. They're the ones who decide whether you get the building permit, what has to be done, and they deal with any enforcement and inspections. So quickly on accessibility, accessibility is not new to the Building Code. There was a big push on it over the last few years in keeping with the Accessibilities for Disabilities for Ontarians Act process, but it's actually been in the code forever, since 1975 at least, in code terms, when it came into existence. So we filed amendments to the code to pick up these accessibility requirements that I'll talk about later. Those were filed in 2013, came into effect in January 1st, 2015. So as of that point, any building permit application that's made has to comply with the amended requirements. Generally speaking, none of the accessibility requirements apply to houses with one minor exception. So the main thing in terms of accessibility is what we call barrier-free path of travel. That's the ability of people to enter, move through, and exit from a building. And that touches on a whole bunch of different areas. So we change things like doorway widths, enhanced requirements for passing and rest spaces in hallways so that people can move their wheelchairs in and out. Some requirements on power door operators at residential buildings and barrier-free washroom entrances. Some things on curb ramps, that's where you leave the building. Tactile walking surface requirements, again, those are things that some of you may be dealing with head office design requirements. Will also probably be having them have some rules on that. And where you have rooftop amenities like rooftop patios, those are now considered to be on the barrier-free path of travel. So if the public is supposed to be getting access to that space, it has to be barrier-free.
So Chris, let me inject with a question here. What I noticed that's missing out of this that I think would be a concern to retailers is it doesn't get into stackouts or any displays that a retailer is going to be putting up at all. Obviously, this legislation is not designed to address those, but from a practical standpoint, and maybe I'll put the words into everyone's mouth here, it's obviously something they need to be conscious of as well, too, for mobility within that workplace outside of this legislation regardless. Absolutely. Now, the building code generally, how do I put this? I use an analogy, and like all analogies, it's kind of loose and doesn't cover everything. But what the building code covers in a building is if you imagine the building and you pick it up, you turn it upside down, and you shake really vigorously, anything that doesn't fall out is probably the building code. So things like shelf and rack systems, those probably would stay in place. Those are part of the building. But things like some of the shelving and display racks and things like that might not be part of the building. They'll be under the ADO regulations in terms of access around them. But the path of travel is generally stated through the building code. One of the other things that will be really of interest to retailers is on slide 9, where we made some changes to vestibules. We had been informed that there were some problems where people got kind of stranded between doors and vestibules. So they made some changes to require that there be powered door operators on both doors and a 1.5 meter clearance. That's the minimum turning radius for a wheelchair. While I'm thinking of wheelchairs, one of the things I'd like to point out is when we did this exercise, the wheeled device that we paid attention to was only a manual wheelchair, not a scooter. I repeat, a manual wheelchair, not a scooter. The building code does not make allowance for scooters, only a wheelchair. So that's when you see the 1.5 meter turning radius, that's why. So moving on to ramps, we did have some significant discussion and consultation about moving to a 1 in 15 slope from the previously existing 1 in 12. What we decided after discussion with experts was that there was no call to change that, and we're keeping it at 1 in 12. Vertical access, which is code speak for what most people would recognize as elevators. There are options, that's why. You can use ramps, you could use lifts, there are other different ways of providing vertical access, but it's largely going to be elevators. So in most uses or occupancies of buildings, like theaters, community centers, large restaurants, you have to provide elevators. Care buildings, commercial and retail buildings such as supermarkets or shops if you've got multiple stories. In most cases, frankly, you're probably going to be doing that anyway. Your business needs, the demands of your clients, the demands of your head office, design system, all of those things are probably going to push you in that direction anyway. We did make a small exception for smaller residential buildings, but on the whole,
basically, if you've got a multi-story use, you're probably going to be having to contemplate putting in an elevator. So floors without, so if you had a residential space that you didn't have to provide a barrier, an elevator to, you still need to do a certain number of things in terms of barrier-free access, but they're fairly logical and they're fairly low cost. What we have done is also a fair number of changes to renovation requirements. So generally, barrier-free requirements apply to renovations only when it's an extensive renovation. So that means walls, floors, ceilings, or any of them, and whether the floor is on an accessible level. So if you could get to the floor on a barrier-free basis, then certain things are required. We recognized that this, in some cases, again, with a smaller suites, or those which are not on an accessible floor level, think of an office, you know, up a flight of stairs on a strip mall, there's no really practical way for them to be barrier-free. So we had to come up with some alternatives. So our nickname for them is barrier-free light. And what we've done is, in slide 9, there's a number of things that in those situations you have to do that you wouldn't have to do if you were a much larger suite or one that is already barrier-free accessible. And those are related to like larger door widths, lever door handles, visual cues, and also a slightly new type of washroom stall. It's called an accessible, an ambulatory accessible stall. What that basically is it's a stall not as big as an accessible stall, but it has enough space for like a walker or a service animal, because people who are blind or people who may have a prosthesis, they can make their way up a flight of stairs typically, but they may have a need for some extra space in the washroom stall. Universal washrooms, that's a hot topic. What we did in the amendments to the code were to require at least one in all new buildings. And multi-story buildings had to provide one for every 3 floors. Now, there was some rapid misconceptions that got into the system. The code does not say where you have to put those. So you calculate the number by taking the number of floors and dividing it by 3, but that doesn't mean that they have to be on floor 1 and then floor 3 and then floor 6. They can be distributed throughout the building based on client need and public access. They also don't have to be in areas where there is no requirement for a washroom currently. So in underground parking garages as a key example, or in the residential portions of apartment buildings. The other misconception is that we don't say that you have to have a specific type of adult change table in the universal washroom. What we say in the code is that there be space for an adult change table in that universal washroom. And there's a really good reason for that. It's that there's a whole bunch of different ways right now to provide an adult change table, and no one particular solution predominates. So failing a movement towards a CSA standard or some other kind of thing that we could reference, we've left it basically up to the designer and their client to work out how they will address that situation beyond the space being provided. If you're in a small building, under 300 square meters in building area, you still have to have a universal washroom, but you don't need to have the space for the adult change table. We also have a number of things that we've started doing in the code that recognize the needs of small retail and restaurant uses in terms of getting rid of some of the requirements on gender in washrooms, so allowing more non-gendered washrooms.
So Chris, let me throw one in here because I'm going to combine a couple of these last slides together. So question 1, let's say that I'm a small retail location or medium-sized retailer location that's externally facing on a mall, kind of like a Sears is set up in most mall locations. I'm doing a renovation not around where my washrooms are, no requirement for me to put a universal washroom in at that point in time, correct?
Generally speaking, your requirements for a building permit are going to be entirely focused on what is the work that you're getting a permit for.
Okay.
So, again, another principle of the code is that the permit's for the work. It doesn't force you to do other work. So the permit's for the work. If you are not doing something elsewhere in the building code generally doesn't reach in and make you do things that you hadn't planned on doing.
Perfect. So the good analogy for this would be if I'm redoing that vestibule or having it set up so that we have ease of access to get into it, if there was, say, a ramp area, we have to allow a wheelchair to be able to articulate itself and pass through, or maybe even we set it up to be large enough for a scooter. We put in the push buttons to allow those doors to automatically open. If I'm specifying I'm going to be doing work on that area, even if my plans are not to do those things, now I need to start thinking about integrating those elements into that change because of the footprint of where it is taking place.
You wouldn't, if you're getting a building permit for like your entryway, that would be what you would be getting the permit for.
Yes.
That doesn't obligate you to do any changes anywhere else in the building.
No, just on that specific area.
On that specific thing, but yes, if you were doing a change to the entranceway, you would be having to meet the current requirements.
Perfect.
Anyway, so barrier-free washrooms, we made some changes. They're largely, with the exception of the power door operators at the entrance door to a washroom that has an accessible stall. So that's not the stall itself, that's the door by which you gain access to the washroom area. Has to have a power door operator, or none at all if you have no, like where you have no door, so it's just free access. You see that a lot now in malls and other assembly occupancies. And some other tinkering around mounting heights, the getting rid of the diagonal support bar and going with an L shape, and a number of other things that were fairly technical in nature. Other changes, again, relating to generally things like mounting heights for switches and thermostats that can be controlled by the occupant. Some things about accessible seating and drinking fountains, and some things around hotel rooms, including power door operator at the suite entrance, where it's the accessible suite as opposed to everything else. Anyway, that's a quick jaunt through what was better part of 3 years of work, but at any rate, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can look at our website, and also Patrick has my coordinates as well, and if you have any technical questions, he knows where to find me. And if you're curious about the other bits that we did, there's some things in there on visual on apartment buildings and houses and pools and spas, but they may or may not be relevant to you, so I've stuck them in an appendix.
And we'll make sure those are provided afterwards.
Yep.
As part of the recording, where people can spend a little bit more time pausing, going through this if there is some application. But Chris, thank you. You've answered half the questions I'm sure you're going to get, because we will have a number that will come up at the end. But thank you for taking the time. I know you're sticking around for that question period at the end. So let's transition. Wendy, thank you for coming. I know for a lot of retailers, they're really looking forward to hearing what other retailers are doing with respect to not only the AODA, but also especially the implementation of the building code requirements.
No, and first I wanted to just say thank you to the Retail Council of Canada for hosting another round of webinars relating to AODA. It really is a great way for the retail community to stay informed and connected on such an important topic. And I'm very happy to be a part of it, so thank you.
No, thank you. Okay, so like webinar number 1, we've got our questions laid out here. I'm going to ad-lib a little bit, and then you'll have your responses. So question 1, and some of these were provided by individuals from our committee, retailers that provided some information ahead of time. But question 1 was, which specific groups or teams have been key internal resources when incorporating accessibility for customers and employees through the building and renovation process in the case of TJX?
So at TJX Canada, we do have an active AODA committee within our organization that's been active since 2008. And we have representatives from multiple areas of the business, such as HR compliance, customer service marketing, talent acquisition, health and safety, learning development, property development, and store operations. This group meets biannually to discuss the impact the AODA regulation has on our business and to plan accordingly. So when it came time to look at the building code requirements as it relates to accessibility, our property development committee member worked closely with our design, real estate, construction, store operations, health and safety teams, as well as outside architect consultants and equipment manufacturers. So as you can see, it definitely is a team effort.
It's almost like they're doing a SWOT analysis for every new build, and just having all these different groups vet the process. So there really isn't a weakness in that chain of planning at any point.
Absolutely.
It's good.
Yeah.
Next question, and these get progressively harder. I'm sorry. This is a difficult one because really I think every retailer wants to be the driving force behind these changes, but ultimately it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes legislation is something that's pushing people in the direction that we need to go, although with accessibility I think every retailer wants to make this change because we know that there's a benefit, especially for the customers, and also getting the right employees in place. That said, the tougher question here is, which group really fostered the changes at TJX? Was it customers and their feedback? Was it the hiring of employees that had disabilities, or the plan to potentially hire an employee with a disability at some point in the future? Or was it really generated by TJX and their mission statement, their values, as they wanted to move in this path?
I know you say it's a difficult question, but really for us it isn't. It really is all of the above. So we really believe that it is critical to the effectiveness to our approach as we receive feedback from all areas, all of these three areas.
It's a shorter answer than I thought, but that's good. Question 3. I've got to make these harder now. What are some of the structural modifications that TJX has made, not only at the head office, because I know that's a new facility that's been set up, but at the retail locations as well? And then I'll get to my second part question after.
So when we look at our new and retrofitted stores, we have installed accessible fitting rooms. So even though they are required by code in 3 provinces, we have actually gone above and beyond and made a requirement as part of our design guidelines nationally. In addition, all new stores receive a larger stall in the ladies' fitting room, which can accommodate mobility challenges, and moms with strollers can enjoy the extra space as well. So, and you know, last but not least, we've also started to install universal washrooms, including the emergency assistance button. But I know that head office, you referred to us being in a new facility, and I just wanted to touch on that. We are very fortunate to be in a brand new building that we moved into a year ago, but still feels brand new to us for sure. And in 2013, we broke ground with a key mandate to create an environment that's collaborative and inclusive, incorporating many of our core values, including diversity. AODA and the building code requirements align perfectly with this mandate, and as such, we do have a building that's fully accessible. So ramps to building entrances, an auditorium tiered with accessible seating in the front, which you have a picture of in the slide deck for everyone to see. And we also have an accessible outdoor patio with wheelchair accessible seating, as you can also see the images on the slide deck as well. And there's a picture of the ramp. So the space inside focuses on the idea of an open environment, really conducive to flexibility and considering the needs of others. So we offer various styles of seating, white noise machines to help diminish surrounding noises. We also have quiet rooms, so a place to go where no electronic devices are allowed. It's an opportunity for people to go de-stress, meditate, pray, really to help support mental health. In addition, we also have privacy rooms throughout the floors that allow employees to focus on a task or take a private call. And, of course, we've also installed elevator plates that are both tactile characters and in Braille. And then our fitness center is also fully accessible, including the change rooms. And the alarm installed in our data center has both a visual and auditory indicator in the event someone is in a room by themselves who might be hearing impaired. So really something for everybody, inclusion from a broader sense, and really wanted to create an environment that everyone can enjoy and use.
That's great.
Do you want to work for us?
I don't think we're supposed to be making pitches to switch companies on the webinar today, so we might delete that from the final version. I'll detract here, though, and you did answer this at the beginning of your other question that was provided. This legislation is really being pushed heavily in Ontario, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Manitoba. Similar legislation is starting to come into effect. But does TJX have a mandate right now with any new stores that are being opened up in the other provinces to integrate these changes as a best practice now before the legislation really comes into effect there?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Patrick. For all of the AODA requirements, we assessed what can be implemented nationally, and if not right away, we discuss when. So right now, as it relates to the building code, we do ensure we're compliant from a provincial standpoint for new and renovated construction, but with a few exceptions that I'd like to mention. So one example is we have installed removable pin pads at all of our registers across Canada. And another example is the accessible fitting rooms, which I mentioned earlier, which we have also installed on a national scope.
Okay. Let me just fast forward through our pictures here again for everyone to see. Question 4, what recommendations could you provide to help other retailers listening on this webinar to help mitigate or address the costs associated with making structural changes or environmental changes? And we'll look at it from two sides, new building or renovation.
Okay, so if we consider, we really would look at them the same, whether it's new or a major renovation. We really do believe that making our environments accessible just makes good business sense for being an employer of choice and being a retailer of choice. So the more accessible we are, the more customers will be able to shop us, and we'll expand our talent pool from an employee perspective. So in many cases, the benefits we receive often outweigh the costs associated with these changes.
So I think the answer I take from that, if I'm the retailer on the other end, is it's shifting the culture first more than anything else and making sure the parties that are going to be buying into this process really are committed to seeing the changes put into effect. It's not necessarily the dollars that are attached to it. It's understanding how can we work together as a team to seamlessly implement this more than anything else. And that starts to overcome all the other barriers of technology, cost, logistics.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Final question for now. What were the challenges that TJX overcame to support accessible environments, and are there still any challenges left?
As for challenges, with 20,000 employees across Canada and 400 retail locations and still growing, it's definitely ongoing work, and it's definitely not one size fits all. We also really look at our challenges as opportunities, so really changing that that mindset that they're not challenges, they're opportunities. Different ways that we can work to make our work in retail spaces more accessible benefits everyone. So we look at training, constant education, program review, reviewing and addressing requests. One opportunity we identified is in some of our older locations, our associate lounge is on a mezzanine level, so only accessible via stairs. Our approach today is to find retail spaces that can accommodate the lounge on the same floor from an accessibility standpoint, and this is across Canada. So even when we comply with building code requirements, we sometimes receive requests outside of these requirements. So for example, we're working with a customer right now who has environmental sensitivities and enjoys shopping in our stores. So the customer is requesting we have 2 cent-free employees available in each of our GTA locations at all times. So this is an interesting case, considering we carry scented products and our customers are not all scent-free. So we're actually working with the customer to offer alternatives, such as contact us in advance so that we can ensure we have a scent-free associate working when she's shopping in our stores, servicing her at the furthest registers from the rest of our customers without her having to wait in line. So another opportunity we're working through is associate responses to accommodation requests from our customers. An example of this is shifting our family fitting rooms to accessible fitting rooms. We continue to train on how these rooms should be utilized, not for us to question the validity of the request from the customer.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. So our checkout queue lines, should someone need to exit the queue line when they're in the middle of the line, our queue line fixtures are removable as they're on wheels. We also receive requests from customers in certain markets to have a wheelchair on hand in our stores, which we accommodate where we can. And we truly try to manage inventory levels to ensure our stores continue to be shoppable amongst our features. And another opportunity we also look at is we use toxic-free cleaning products in all of our locations. So as we talked about earlier, these are all examples of the business case. So the more effective we make our environments accessible, the more customers and employees we attract and retain. So I definitely feel strongly having an active cross-functional committee working together along with the business that supports the needs of others really helps drive the message home that implementing AODA regs is not a must, but the right thing to do for everyone.
Wendy, I really thank you for being here today. These have been very comprehensive answers, and I still know that there are others out there from retailers. We've got a little bit outside of building code as well, too, to talk about just kind of what exists within even TJX from a customer service standpoint now, which I think provides a little bit of a sense that those things are achievable. Scent-free environments has been brought up by other retailers. It's been asked of me. It's not always an easy thing to do, but it's moving in the right direction based on intent.
Absolutely.
So thank you for coming in. I know you're sticking around for the questions as well, too. So let's start to transition. For everyone that's logged in today for the webinar, I just want to remind everyone that we will have a recording within 2 to 3 days, roughly, of the completion of this webinar for you to download. We also would welcome your comments using the feedback section of WebEx as you begin to log off from our session today. Additionally, for those that are still seeking resources, please take advantage of the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario's information. In some cases, there are going to be specific questions that would be on queue lines, customer service counters, some of the elements that are outside of the Ontario Building Code that we've really focused on today based on the questions that we were provided. And the enforcement branch there, you can contact them anonymously. It can also be a question that's posed through Retail Council of Canada on your behalf that we can receive an answer from the Accessibility Directorate on if you wish to contact us. But we have provided their information in the event you need to reach out to the ADO directly. Now we'll take a brief pause and allow our attendees to submit their questions, and we'll move to our question and answer period in a moment.
Okay, so we have a question here we actually have 2 questions for Chris. So first question, Chris, is there a such thing as undue hardship when it comes to meeting an Ontario Building Code if an owner was conducting renovations?
No, there is not. That's a simple question and a simple answer. There isn't. Basically, as I said, the building code is a mandatory minimum. In order to get a building permit, you have to meet the minimum requirements of the code. That having been said, though, when we actually devise the regulations that form the building code, we try to be very careful and conscious of the fact that there are a lot of business owners and builders out there who are dealing with situations that are really complex and difficult to handle at a site-specific level. That's one of the main reasons why you see that there are differences in the types of buildings and the sizes of buildings that certain requirements apply to. We were trying very much to have sort of to telescope down the demands of meeting the code requirements on small buildings, on existing buildings, to try to make them as cost-effective as possible, but still leaving room for larger buildings and which have more, where there's more resources and more opportunity to, to deal with the space requirements to deal with that at a larger scale.
Okay, so next question is, what is the size of the building for which you require a second washroom?
That is probably not a question to ask me because, as I said, I'm not one of the technical guys. I don't know offhand. That's a question I'd have to actually get back to you.
Okay, so if you could just, direct us in the right direction, and we can actually, we have the contact information of the participants that asked that, and we can get that information to them. Okay, so another question is, how does an employer ensure they have taken the steps needed to ensure that they're meeting the requirements with the standards in all areas of their business for design of public spaces?
Well, the building code and design of public spaces are different things. The building code is the construction requirements for new and existing buildings, and so basically, like the analogy I gave of if you take a building and shake it, the building code is about the building. The design of public spaces is generally about things that are not the building. So walkways, parks, open areas, that kind of thing. That's really where the design of public spaces thing comes into play. And there's a fairly clear divide between the building code and the design of public spaces.
Okay.
Okay, Chris, I've got a tough question for you now. 2 words, heritage building.
Yeah.
Well, again, you're dealing with a situation where you probably may not be on a barrier-free path of travel.
Yep.
So barrier-free path of travel, the basic minimum is you have to be less than, and I said I wasn't a millimeter guy, but it's 800 millimeters difference in grade, or basically 1 step above the sort of the exterior area. So if you think of having to go up 3 or 4 or a flight of steps to get into an old building, you're not on a barrier-free path of travel. So then you're going to kick down into the sort of barrier-free light kind of requirements. And the other thing that's always built into the building code in Part 11, which deals with renovations, is what are called compliance alternatives, which is a way of thinking about the building and the requirements of the code that help to work out how to get as close as possible to the code while still recognizing that you may be dealing with a building whose structural character may not perfectly suit those code requirements now. And building officials are accustomed to dealing with these kind of situations and dealing with compliance alternatives, as are architects or other design professionals. And they're really your best guide for working through, on a heritage building, how do you get as close as practical to the building code while not necessarily diminishing the heritage character of the building. It's a very site-specific and it's a very complex question.
I know it might be a tough one for some of the retailers. That's why I asked, but it's important. At least it gives them kind of the lens of which path to move down at that time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have another question that just came through. What if we share the entrance with more than one business, and we want to make changes to our entrance to meet wheelchair accessible, but they resist? What can we do in this case?
Well, that's not strictly speaking a building code question.
Well,
it's really more a case of how do you work with your relationships with others. You're really not required to retrofit.
Too. Let's say that hypothetically, and I would love to hear additional information from the individual who's posed this question, is the premise actually in a property management owned mall, and it's being shared by multiple retailers, or is there a primary retailer that owns that location and multiple retailers are resting inside of that location? Because now we're starting to get into very interesting dynamics of who has the responsibility to make that change. Is it in the contract for their location that they've rented? And Chris, I know these aren't answers you can necessarily give. It's a very difficult position to be in. I would be welcome to have any emails come directly to me. Please use the email at the bottom of the screen, and we can pitch that question, I think, back to the Accessibility Directorate. But folks, the answer really will end up being who has ownership of that location as the primary responsible party to make those changes. That said, for a retailer, that can be a very difficult position. And Wendy, maybe you can even comment on this because you may have seen it either within TJX or past retailers. That can really hurt the customer relationship at that point in time if you don't have that provided, correct?
Well, and they really look to the retailer versus the property management company, right? So they will approach us directly thinking that we own that outside space that they're not able to necessarily access as easily as they should. But it's not really us, so it's working with our property management companies as well as our customers to try and find middle ground. So.
But I think that's part of the feedback process overall to still gather that information because it makes a good case for a retailer back to a property management firm.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so that's the last question that we have. However, we will keep the question and answer section open for probably another 5 to 10 minutes. So if you do have any questions, you're welcome to put them in there, and we will direct it to the appropriate people for answering. I'll pass it back to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Marcy. Well, folks, I'd like to thank everyone that attended our webinar today. Wendy, Chris, again, thank you very much. I know we haven't been able to always answer every single question that came up today because there's a lot of ambiguity around some of these topics, and they also extend very far into legislation as well, too. But at least we have an opportunity to provide questions afterwards should they come up. Folks, please have a great day. We really appreciate you taking the time to send your staff to this series. Please look forward to our next webinar that will be on accessibility needs on hearing, which will start on September 14th. We'll be sending out a registration link as part of our thank you email for attending webinar number 2, and the link for webinar number 2 with that email in the short future. Until then, please have a fantastic day.